Okay. Hi. Hello, Vermont history students. This is Unit 7's video, and this is the halfway point of the semester. And it's not coincidental, perhaps, that right at the halfway point you meet the turning point in Vermont history, the point around which the contemporary identity of Vermont begins to evolve and really mature, and that is the massive rise of summer tourism in the 1890s. Before we get to that, and I will this time try to keep it within the recommended time frame of 6 to 8 minutes, I've been having a nice discussion a little bit with Jennifer Goodman about the shortage of responses on the discussion board from what I expected. Her suggestion was perhaps I should have been a little stricter about penalties. It is a summer class, and I have taught Vermont history as a summer class for the last 10 years on campus. And you know, it's supposed to be a little flexible, it's supposed to be a little fun, and you know, people get their work done, but I'm not as strict about it as I usually am during the semester. And I thought I could apply that to this course. But I was clear about the guidelines. On Wednesdays and Fridays, I thought there would be posts to the discussion board about the question for each of the units. And there was a little bit early in the semester, and that was great. And I really figured everyone would write in, and then you would have multiple posts, and people would argue with each other, and it would be very interesting and fun. So please, tomorrow, for this question for Unit 7, could you just post a little short response to the question, and I'll respond to you. And then Monday, of course, is when town meetings are due. You know, I tried to be very clear about when the posts to the discussion board were due. Monday, town meeting comments, votes on each of the primary documents were due. We didn't get any this week, so I'll keep an eye out. Hope it's not too late. I really want you to do all your work and get all your work done. In the interest of that, there is a assessment paper, the second one, due on Friday this week, at the end of week 4, 2/3 of the way through the semester. I'm still waiting on the first batch. Please send them on, email them to me or whatever, just write me whatever makes sense for you. And the first paper measures the relative unity of the imagined community of Vermonters between the 1770s and, say, just before the Civil War, the 1840s and 50s, right? And then the second one, due this week, goes from the end of the Civil War to, say, about 1915, 1910, 1920, something like that. Tell it as a story the way that you understand it. Did Vermont grow more unified or divided in that era? And really what you're dealing with in the second paper, the one that's due this Friday, is two eras, the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. And the turning point between the two is the rise of summer tourism, and particularly think of it as the year of 1890. And so, as I'm about to elaborate briefly, the rise of summer tourism, the fact that Vermont's backwardness is its greatest asset and can be exploited and packaged and sold as a means to bring Vermont forward, is really the turning point where you begin to, contemporary Vermont starts to come into focus, okay? So think of it this way, right? So we begin this section in 1890. In the 1870s and 80s, there was an institution called the Board of Agriculture, and the Board of Agriculture was a state agency that constantly told farmers that farming was a business. Farming is a business, and you need to farm in the most modern ways. And doing things like your grandfather did them is a giant mistake. Now, in 1888, the Commissioner of Agriculture, a separate position, was created. Alonzo Valentine from Bennington was appointed to the position in the winter of 1889, and as hopefully you already know, his big great idea was that he was going to replace departing Vermont farmers with Swedes. And so he brought about 55 Swedes to Vermont in the summer of 1890. It elicited this enormous amount of press coverage, and then a lot of people turned around and said, well, that's stupid. We're not going to, what's it going to look like when we have like tens of thousands of Swedes here? They're not coming, and it's stupid. So the program was discontinued in 1890. And as you're going to see for the rest of the semester, we will hopefully be able to trace the lives of the Swedes who came over in 1890 and their descendants, because they are representative of the experiences of lots of Vermonters, and it's a really interesting story. And that, of course, is where your use of Ancestry.com can come in. If you want to do some genealogical research, if you want to use Ancestry.com in order to trace the Swedes or to trace your own ancestors or whatever, I'm totally open to the idea. But what happened is, after one of the things that Valentine had done was that he had gathered together this enormous amount of information, the first actual comprehensive list of what farms were available for sale in Vermont, and thinking that maybe he would be able to sell them to Swedes or sell them to farmers from elsewhere, or maybe because he's maybe a mad genius, he was actually just did the Swedes thing as a gimmick to alert summer tourism people that farms were cheap and plentiful. But the Board of Agriculture took the list that Valentine drew up of farms available for sale and published it as a pamphlet called A List of Desirable Vermont Farms at Low Prices. And within 6 years, they had ripped off the cover and put on a fancy cover with flowers on it, and it was called Vermont, Its Fertile Fields and Summer Homes. And that's what you want to think of as representative of what happened between about 1890 and 1900, which is summer tourism exploded. And when I teach this class in person, it's always a really fun class. I have lots of overheads and lots of primary documents and lots of questions, and because what happens is downhillers get very confused. They used to think that Vermont's backwardness was the worst thing about it. Now it's the best thing about it. Now it can be packaged and sold as a means to bring Vermont forward. But the problem is that if you exploit Vermont's backwardness too much in order to bring it forward, then you destroy the very source of your asset. Vermont won't be backward anymore. But what emerges out of this, which is lovely, is this language about balance. Downhillers begin to figure out that what you do is you sell Vermont as full of all the modern conveniences of contemporary life, but also still retaining all those ancient virtues and traits that are lost elsewhere. And so it's modernity added to tradition. And so these two things come together perfectly. As Glimpses of the White River Valley put it in 1901, Vermont is the ideal existence because it offers fertile fields for progress and development and self-actualization, but also life is simple, sweet, satisfying, peaceful, wonderful. You have the best of both worlds. Now, that's what, of course, I would ask my students. Is this the original vision of the founders who wanted freedom and unity balanced? Is this actual balance, or is it some sort of weird perversion of the original founders' vision? Certainly downhillers were very confused at the time, but they formed organizations like the Development Association, which of course is meant to develop but preserve Vermont. There's new magazines like Vermonter magazine, which sells Vermont as a peaceful, idyllic place full of entrepreneurs. And so downhillers are very confused. But one thing about downhillers is, even when they're confused, they still do things. They never just sit and wait and figure it out. They get things done. And they had been modernizing state services, roads, schools, fish and game laws, a host of things for the previous decade or two, which had made uphillers mad. But then they were turning around and selling Vermont as still being pre-modern, as still being idyllic. And the result of this was that there was an explosion of uphill anger right at the turn of the century, which culminated in the governor's election of 1902. Not to confuse you, but the guy who built Shelburne Farms, William Seward Webb, was gonna be the Republican nominee. He only lived in Vermont for 3 or 4 months out of the year, and it was a very bad time in 1902 for some outsider to be running for governor, when uphillers were already mad at all of the out-of-state people moving up and buying farms. So Webb dropped out, and then the guy who was gonna be the nominee, a guy named McCullough, who was actually a native of Delaware, he lived in Bennington. He was challenged by a guy who owned the Rutland Herald newspaper, Percival Clement, who jumped into the race because he wanted to have prohibition reversed, prohibition repealed. Vermont had been a dry state since 1853. The reason it had been dry is because downhillers at the time were in that sort of Jacksonian spirit of temperance, but they changed their mind by 1902 for two good reasons. Number one, it's hard to attract Catholics to work in factories when you're a dry state. And number two, tourists want to drink Chardonnay on the porches of fancy hotels. In the meantime, uphillers had gone from hating Prohibition to loving it because their communities had become very homogenous and consensus driven. They had reversed positions. Got it? So basically, uphillers were infuriated, and the 1902 election was so bitter. The way that it panned out was that it got to the point where newspapers were begging people not to talk about it in public because they get red in the face and angry, which is unusual to say the least for Vermont politics, which traditionally had run very smoothly. A small number of people decided who was going to be governor years in advance and all that. And this was this enormous disruption in it. My question for you perhaps then is that when you see this enormous explosion of energy and fury, and particularly an enormous amount of debate about who is a Vermonter, and is Webb a Vermonter, is McCullough a Vermonter, is Fletcher Proctor, who is Redfield Proctor, the rich guy's son, he's born in Vermont, but is he any different from Webb? And who is a Vermonter and what is a Vermonter? When you see people arguing so furiously like that, is that progress? Are we making progress towards reconciling freedom and unity, or is that a bad time to try to make progress? Do you have to wait for things to calm down? But more than anything, I also want you to think about if downhillers are selling uphill life to outsiders who want conveniences but also want to escape modern life. If downhillers are selling a prettified version of uphill life, does it mean that downhillers will have more respect for uphillers than they used to have, or even less than before? And so I can't wait to hear what you have to say about that. Is that good? Write me emails, get in touch. I'm here, and I'm looking forward to hearing.